in his prayer, Bo mentioned the men of faith, and we've been talking about men and women of faith throughout the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. And it is in regard to the statement that is made subsequent to that in Hebrews 12, and particularly the first two verses. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside the weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. That great cloud of witnesses is what we've been looking at over the course of the last few weeks. Last week we looked at, or sometime, I lose track of time. Last time I talked about this, we talked about Jacob, and he's found in verse 21. And the thing about faith that is mentioned in regard to Jacob is when he was dying, number one, he blessed each of the sons of Joseph, and secondly, he worshiped leaning on the top of his staff. And, that is such a marvelous statement, and even this evening as I looked and I saw, and I don't mean to embarrass anyone, but I saw Miss Francis come in, and I don't know if you brought a walker tonight. I know sometimes you do, but she comes and worships leaning on the top of her walker. And I see Marilyn come in, and she worships leaning on her oxygen tank. And I just look at that and I think, we appreciate that, don't we? The whole congregation, we appreciate that so much. And it is such an encouragement to us, and it tells us that we need to do better. And we love you all and appreciate you all so much. And that's what we looked at in regard to Jacob last week. And so let's continue this evening and look at Jacob's son, Joseph. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. Two things there that we want to be sure that we take in. That he made mention of the departure of the children of Israel, and that he gave instructions concerning his bones. He was certain about the first thing. He asked them to take an oath to carry out the second thing. So in just, bringing this to our minds, remember that Joseph was born to Jacob in Genesis chapter 30 after God finally opens Rachel's womb. He's specially favored by Jacob. You read about that in Genesis 37 and verse 3. And Joseph's brothers are jealous of him, envious enough to kill him, some of them. And Joseph also had some dreams that turned out to be prophetic dreams. And this didn't help his relationship with his brothers at all. And they became even more envious of him, and they hated him even more. And so when they got the chance, they sold Joseph to Midianite traders who took him down to Egypt. They dipped his special coat that Jacob had given him in blood and presented it to their father, leaving the impression that Joseph had been killed by wild animals. When the traders got Joseph down to Egypt, they sold him to a man named Potiphar. And Potiphar was the officer in charge of a lot of things. Among them, that job carried being in charge of executions. And it's interesting that the word that's used for officer there is the same word that is used in the Hebrew many times that means eunuch. And it was customary in the Egyptian government to require prominent officials in the king's court to be castrated. And there were, a few reasons for that. Number one, it ensured a devotion to duty, because only the most devoted servant would be willing to do that in the first place. And it also minimized the chance of a coup because the person was unable to establish their own dynasty. And some have suggested that maybe that was the reason for Potiphar's wife's wandering eye. I don't know about that, but anyway, food for thought. Well, Joseph quickly showed an aptitude for managing a household. In fact, it's interesting that Joseph first managed a household and a prison before he managed Egypt. And so God helped Joseph and made sure that Potiphar noticed Joseph's good work. And before long, Joseph was running Potiphar's house. He was in charge of everything. It reached the point, the Bible tells us, that Potiphar no longer monitored any of Joseph's movements or decisions. He trusted him so much. And there's a lot of stress placed on the fact that Potiphar was an Egyptian. In Genesis 39, verse 1, that's stated again in verse 2, again in verse 5. And since Joseph is in Egypt, you sort of take for granted that an officer in Pharaoh's court would be an Egyptian unless the events here happened during the Hyksos, and you can study about them, Hyksos. There was a short time that the Hyksos dynasty ruled in Egypt. And so if it was the Hyksos that were ruling now, then that would be one reason why the Bible would bring up that Potiphar was an Egyptian on more than one occasion. So you can look into that and see what you think. Now, the scriptures show that Joseph had grown to be a very handsome man. He was probably in his 20s at this time. And Potiphar's wife took note of Joseph and decided that she wanted to have him. And it probably would have been a thing that would be tempting, but Joseph flatly refused her advances every time. And, it's interesting when you look at some of the sexual activity of Joseph's family, his brothers, particularly Reuben, you see that Joseph was his own man. He made his own decisions, and he was loyal to God and loyal to his employer. And so that's why Joseph gave Potiphar's wife two solid reasons why he must reject her advances. Number one, that Potiphar trusted him with everything in Egypt. And it would be doing a disservice and a betrayal of his employer's trust. And secondly, the sin would betray God, and Joseph realized by this point that the whole scheme of his brothers selling him and getting him to Egypt was all God's doing anyway. That God had sent him there to preserve life, to interpret Pharaoh's dreams and do what was necessary for the upcoming 7-year famine. So Potiphar's wife's offer, it didn't just happen once. It went on kind of on a daily basis, and she constantly pursued him. And Joseph did his best to ignore her, but you know the story. She finally cornered him and tried to have him, and he left his garment with her and fled the house. And you would think that would be the end of it, but her infatuation with Joseph then turned to rage, and she really cried out for the servants to come. She made an allegation that Joseph had tried to rape her, and she said that having the coat there further supported her claim. And she told her husband, and Joseph was thrown into prison. Potiphar, from the scriptures, you see that Potiphar was furious. But, again, we see God's hand in this, because the kind of activity that Joseph is accused of would normally carry the death sentence, and Potiphar would be the one to carry that out. But that wasn't what happened. Joseph was put into prison. We see God's hand in this. We may also see that Potiphar didn't fully trust his wife's story. And we also, it's probably hinted very much that Potiphar saw that Joseph was special, not like others. We don't have any indication through all this that Joseph himself made any heroic effort to defend himself. And it sort of reminds me of the statement about Jesus in Isaiah 53 that, as a lamb to the slaughter, so he opened not his mouth. And it reminds us of what Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 2, that if you suffer for an evildoer, that's no credit to you. But if you suffer for righteousness' sake, the Lord takes special notice of that. So the jail where Joseph was placed, this would be about chapter 40 of Genesis. He was placed in the same prison that Potiphar ran for Pharaoh. And jails are not a pleasant place, and in that day and time, they were much less pleasant than they are now. And so Joseph would have spent his time there, probably in the beginning, locked in leg irons and that kind of thing. But again, God gave him favor, and eventually he ran the prison just like he ran Potiphar's house, and everything was entrusted to him. And it was during this time that the Pharaoh's chief butler and his cupbearer, his baker, were tossed into jail. And both of them were in charge of duties for Pharaoh. And some have surmised from this that maybe there was an attempt at some point to poison the Pharaoh. We don't know. But some point during their jail term, they both had dreams, prophetic dreams, that would have to be interpreted. And seeing their distress, Joseph offered to interpret their dreams by asking God on their behalf to show that to them. And so God told Joseph the dreams. The butler's dream would mean that he'd be reinstated to his office in 3 days. The baker took hope from this good interpretation, and he too said, interpret my dream. However, he soon learned that his dream meant that he would be dead in 3 days. And so Joseph asked the butler to plead his case before Pharaoh once he was reinstated. 3 days later, everything happened just the way Joseph said it would, but the butler forgot about Joseph for 2 years. Now you notice through all this that God remained with Joseph. Remember, Paul said in Romans 8 and verse 28, all things, and that would include the things that we look as bad things, all things will be made to work for good for those who are God's children. And sometimes when we look at those things, maybe they don't look that way. I can't imagine that Joseph thought, this is God's plan for me to be in prison. I can't imagine that. But everything worked for his good. Joseph's loyalty to God was tested by all the troubles that he had, and Joseph just passed the test every time. And so even though, on the outside looking in, it looks like everything goes wrong for him for nearly 13 years, Joseph never abandons his faith in God, and God never abandons Joseph. And notice that Joseph was being trained through all of this because his greatest mission was about to come up to save the land of Egypt and to save all humanity, really. And so 2 years after the butler returned to his position, Pharaoh had 2 disturbing dreams. You probably remember them, one having to do with the skinny cattle and the fat cattle, and the other with the skinny heads of grain and the fat heads of grain. And no one could interpret the dreams. And so it was then that the butler remembered Joseph, that he should have remembered 2 years prior. He apologized to Pharaoh for not telling him about him. And when you look at the writings of Herodotus, an ancient historian, the Egyptians were very particular about cleanliness, and beards were only allowed to grow when a person was in mourning. And so before being presented to Pharaoh, Joseph was washed and shaved and bathed and then clothed again. And when asked to interpret Pharaoh's dream, Joseph once again indicates that the interpretation would not be coming from him personally, but from God. And, that's always been his motive. The dreams meant there was going to be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of extreme drought and famine. The fact that there were 2 dreams that meant the same thing, Joseph said, God is trying to show you how sure and how certain that this is going to happen in the near future. So Joseph suggests to Pharaoh, he never suggests that he be the one that carry this out, but he just says to Pharaoh, preparations need to be made for this great famine that's coming, and you need to set up a man to save 20%, 1/5 of Egypt's produce during these 7 years of plenty. And so a 20% tax rate, that would have been something that really was unheard of at that time. Most countries, including Egypt, generally collected 10% from the people. So this would have been, doubling that. And few people would save this much wealth on their own. Joseph just said you need to set up a man to do this. Pharaoh couldn't think of a better man, a more qualified man than Joseph. And so he puts him in charge. He says, you're second in command in Egypt. You have full power to implement this plan and to do whatever you need to do. And he gave Joseph an Egyptian name, Zaphnath-Paneah, which means abundance of life. He was also given the daughter of a very notable Egyptian priest to be his wife. And that marriage to a priest's daughter probably gave Joseph the authority by the laws of the land to rule, even though he was not an Egyptian. Of course, Pharaoh he could do that anyway. By this time, Joseph had reached the age of 30. 30 is a crucial age in the Bible. That's the time when men in the Bible were considered full adults. David became a king when he was 30, 2 Samuel 5. And Levites started serving God when they turned 30, according to Numbers chapter 4. And you might also remember that Jesus started his ministry when he was 30, according to Luke chapter 3. And so Joseph fulfills all of his duty, and the wealth that he collected was so great. It says in Genesis 41 and verse 49, they stopped counting it because it was immeasurable. It just came in, and we have, by the way, you can do some great research, archaeological research on these underground bins that they have discovered in Egypt that are evidence of this great collection that was going on. Pardon me. And it was also during this time that Joseph had 2 sons. The first one was called Manasseh, which means forgetting. And then you had Ephraim, which means doubly fruitful. And so after the period of wealth, sure enough, here came the famine. Verse 54, the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. The famine was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt, there was bread. And so the people had made no provisions for themselves, apparently, during the good times. The only provision that had been made was what Joseph said in the 20% tariff. So Joseph didn't simply hand out the food that they'd collected, he sold it to the people. And you know, one thing we learn is that people tend to be careless with things that they get for free. If there's any politicians listening, I hope you hear that. But people that have to pay for things, generally, they understand more that this comes at a price, and they take care of those things, and hopefully the people would be frugal with what Joseph allotted them. So Joseph didn't just sell grain to the Egyptians, he sold grain to all the neighboring lands. In fact, you know, that's how his family ended up coming down there and settling there in Goshen eventually. And so from chapter 42 of Genesis on, you have the story of Joseph's family coming back to Egypt. We've talked some about, you know, how Joseph revealed himself to his brothers and all of that. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go into all that. But you remember his family getting down to Egypt. And eventually, in Genesis chapter 50, we get to the end of Joseph's life. Beginning in verse 22, it says, "So Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household. And Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. The children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were also brought up on Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt." Now you might remember, this is not the first time we've heard that. You go back to Genesis chapter 15 and verses 13 and 14, after Abraham had cut all of these pieces of the animals in half, and the covenant that God was making, and he was having this vision, and God says to Abram, "Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions." That's Genesis 15. And that's Abraham. And as you see, that was repeated to Isaac, and it was repeated to Jacob as well. In Genesis chapter 47, and in verse 29, it says, "When the time drew near that Israel," that is Jacob, "must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, Now if I have found favor in your sight, please put your hand under my thigh and deal kindly and truly with me. Please do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. You shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place." And he said, "I'll do as you have said." He said, "Swear to me," and swore to him. So Israel bowed himself on the head of his bed. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph had faith that God was going to do what he said he would do. And so our statement of faith in Hebrews 11 and verse 22 is that Joseph gave commandment. He knew that God was going to bring them out, and he gave commandment concerning his bones. Now you see what happened here was that he was embalmed and put in a coffin. That wasn't typical for Israelites in the land of Canaan. It was typical for Egyptians in the land of Egypt. So Joseph prophesied that Israel would not remain in Egypt, and that they would go to the land that God promised them. And he makes them swear that when they go, not if, when God brings you out, you take my bones with you. Joseph understood that the soul of man was what was important, and God was going to take care of that. But he also wanted to make a statement that he lived in Egypt, but he was not an Egyptian. He lived in Egypt as an Israelite, as a Hebrew, as one in the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that he wanted that statement made in a very illustrative way that you could see, a pictorial way, that you could see them taking his remains to the land of Canaan. He made mention of the departing of the children of Israel. Remember when he did this? He did this when he was dying. I can't think of any greater service that you and I can do for our children and our grandchildren and all of our family, is that as we near the end of our lives, that we make mention of the promises of God, of our faith in them. Not if, but when it happens. You and I need to assure those of our family. We need to be assured ourselves, and we need to pass that on. In the case of Joseph, when he was dying, God gives people living comforts in dying moments. What a precious gift to be able to hold on to, that as we know our time here is coming to an end, that we know just assuredly that our time in heaven is about to begin. And we have absolute confidence and faith in that. That's why the Hebrew writer tells us, look to Joseph. Joseph was one that is a witness that surrounds us, one of many, that encourages us, lay aside the sin and the weight that ensnares you, and run with endurance the race that's set before you, like Joseph did. Don't let anything hold you back. Being in a foreign land, being slaves, whatever. Don't let anything hold you back, and keep your faith in what God has promised He will surely bring about. And so I hope that Joseph will be another of these great witnesses that will encourage you and I to do the same thing. And we'll move on to the next one if the Lord gives us another time to be together. Thank you for your attention and looking at all of that. And I hope that it encourages us all to truly look to these men and to be more steadfast and sure in our faith. If there's one here this evening who is not yet a Christian, who has not yet confessed their faith in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, and repented and been baptized for the remission of sins, to access the blood of Jesus that is the only sacrifice capable of taking our sins away and making us just and righteous again. If you've not done that, everything's ready that you can do that this evening, and we'd encourage you to. And if there is a Christian, a brother or sister in Christ here tonight, and you have faltered in your faith, and you need the strength and encouragement of your brethren, the prayers, whatever we can do this side of eternity so that we can be where we need to be in eternity, we want to do that as well. If we can help you, come up and let us know right now while we stand and sing.